stay exactly where you are, for the fire is still warm, and the fog of the Thames has yet to reach our doorstep. We have gathered tonight to peel back the velvet curtains of the 19th century, a world of grand progress and elegant shadows. Before we begin our walk through these gaslit corridors, I invite you to join our circle. If the rustle of old pages and the mysteries of the past offer you the refuge you seek from the modern world, please consider leaving a mark of your presence. A like, a thoughtful comment, or sharing this chronicle with a fellow seeker of shadows helps keep our lanterns burning through the night. Your company is the heartbeat of these stories. I have a question for you, and I want you to be honest with yourself. Do you truly believe you are resilient? You sit there in the glow of a modern LED, perhaps with a glass of filtered water and the comfort of a temperature-controlled room, convinced that your life is a series of stresses. But tonight, I want to challenge that belief. I want to take you back to a time when simply reaching for a piece of bread or a glass of milk was a game of Russian roulette. I want to see if you would actually survive a single week in the year 1850. You think your life is difficult? By the time we finish this journey, you will realize that your modern existence is a miracle of luxury, and the Victorians you admire were walking through a gauntlet of death every single day. Let us start with the most basic of human needs: sustention. In our world, we have organic labels, health inspectors, and expiration dates. In the 1800s, the Victorian pantry was a house of mirrors where nothing was as it seemed. Imagine waking up in a London townhouse, the coal smoke staining the morning light. You sit down for breakfast, reaching for a loaf of white bread. It looks pristine, but the baker, struggling to turn a profit in a city of millions, has mixed the flour with alum, chalk, and even ground bone to make it appear whiter and heavier. Your pure bread is a chemical cocktail that will slowly erode your stomach lining. But perhaps you prefer a glass of milk. In the mid-Victorian era, the milk you drank often came from swill dairies, cows kept in dark, filth-ridden basements, fed on the fermented waste of whiskey distilleries. The milk was thin, blue, and teeming with tuberculosis. To fix this, the milkman would add a splash of mid-Victorian WebMD logic, a mixture of water, starch, and a spoonful of calves' brains to give it that creamy, rich texture you expect. You weren't drinking nutrition, you were consuming the concentrated essence of urban decay. If you survived the breakfast, you might seek refreshment in a glass of water. But in 1850, there were no falsified IDs. To get a clean drink, there was only the pump at the end of the street. This water was drawn from the same Thames that served as London's open sewer, a gray, pulsing vein of cholera and typhoid. Every sip was a gamble with the Blue Death. We romanticize the Victorian tea hour, but that tea was often made with recycled leaves from a servant's bin, dyed with poisonous copper carbonate to restore its green hue. Every meal was a slow-motion execution, a world where the very act of eating was a test of your body's ability to process toxins. The sentence of death was often hidden in the cure. But as we leave the kitchen and move toward the most private corners of the Victorian home, the reality becomes even more visceral. You see, the dangers of the pantry were merely the prologue. The true test of your stomach and your survival was found not in what you consumed, but in what the Victorian city did with the aftermath. We have only just begun to scratch the soot from the surface of this century. And believe me, the bathroom was merely one of the brutal realities waiting for you in the dark. The fire pops and hisses, a small defiance against the encroaching cold. We have survived the poison of the Victorian breakfast, but now we must confront a reality that no period drama will ever truly show you. We live in an age of porcelain solitude, where a simple flush erases our existence, and the scent of lavender hides the truth of our biology. But to step into a Victorian street is to realize that the great progress of the 19th century was built upon a foundation of human waste. Here is a terrifying fact. In the 1850s, London was not a city of perfumes and silk. It was a city of 3 million people drowning in their own filth. Imagine the scatological shock of a world without a sewage system. Your elegant Victorian terrace house, with its fine molding and velvet chairs, sat directly above a brick-lined pit called a cesspool. Everything that left your body dropped into this dark underground chamber, where it fermented for years. When the pit grew full, the night soil men would arrive, manual laborers who spent their lives shoveling liquid human waste into carts by moonlight. If you think your job is beneath you, imagine being a career counselor for a boy whose only future is neck-deep in the city's excrement. But even the cesspools couldn't hold the tide. As the population exploded, the waste began to seep through the floorboards of the poor and overflow into the streets of the wealthy. The Thames, the majestic river we see in romantic paintings, had become a thick, black, pulsing sewer. It was so concentrated that in the summer of 1858, the great stink became so unbearable that Parliament had to soak their curtains in chloride of lime just to breathe. This wasn't just a nuisance, it was a biological weapon. You think your skincare routine is essential? The Victorian approach to hygiene was a nightmare of medieval remnants. Most people believed that water was a dangerous invader that opened the pores to miasma, the deadly vapors of disease. A full bath was a rare, exhausting ritual, often shared by the entire family in the same lukewarm water. Instead, they relied on sponge bathers, using a damp cloth to move the grime around without ever truly removing it. Underneath those magnificent gowns and stiff collars was a landscape of skin that had not seen soap in months. They were a society of gilded masks, hiding bodies that were, quite literally, rotting in the stagnant air of their own homes. But the most visceral horror was reserved for the poor. In the tenements of the East End, 100 people might share a single outdoor privy that emptied into a stagnant court. There was no paper, no privacy, and no escape. The comfort of the modern world is the ability to forget that we are animals, but the Victorian was reminded of it with every breath. They lived in a constant state of low-level nausea, a world where the stench of death was so pervasive that people carried nosegays of flowers just to keep from fainting in the street. The bathroom was just the beginning of the assault on your senses, but the visceral reality of filth was merely a backdrop for the true grinding gears of the Victorian machine. You see, if you survived the toxins in your food and the pathogens in your water, you still had to face the most brutal reality of all: the cost of your labor. I urge you to stay with us until the very end of this chronicle, for as harrowing as these shadows are, the secrets of the Victorian factory and the lightning surgery are the only way to truly understand the resilience of the human spirit. The light is fading, and the most intense revelations of our walk through the 1800s are still waiting just beyond the next gas lamp. The fire is burning lower now, the orange light flickering against the spines of books that tell tales of brave knights and virtuous maidens. We have been raised on the myth of Victorian glamour, the sweeping ball gowns, the gallant officers, and the polite society of the drawing room. But tonight, I want to shatter that porcelain dream. For the overwhelming majority of people in the 1800s, life was not a ballroom. It was a thresher. If you think your 40-hour work week is a soul-crushing burden, you would not have lasted a single morning in the gears of progress. Let us deconstruct the fantasy. We imagine the Victorian woman as a delicate creature of lace and leisure, but the reality was the match girl, or the mule spinner. Imagine a girl of 12, standing for 14 hours in a textile mill, where the temperature is kept at a sweltering 90 degrees to keep the cotton threads from snapping. The air is so thick with fluff, tiny airborne fibers, that her lungs are being slowly coated in a layer of felt. There are no human resources departments here. There is only the overseer and the machine. If she slows down, she is fined. If she falls asleep, the machine, which has no mercy, will simply take her arm. This was the career path for millions, a relentless, bone-shaking rhythm that aged children into elders before they hit their 20s. And what of the dashing gentleman? For the working man, the Victorian routine was a slow-motion war. Imagine the navvy, the man who built the railways and the tunnels of London. He worked with a shovel and black powder, moving tons of earth by hand in conditions that would make a modern construction site look like a playground. He was paid in Tommy shops, vouchers that could only be spent at the company store for overpriced, adulterated food. He lived in a shanty town of mud and timber, his body breaking down by the age of 35. We look at the beautiful brickwork of the Victorian age and see architecture. They looked at it and saw a graveyard of men who literally worked themselves to death to build a world they would never be allowed to enjoy. Here's a terrifying fact. The very clothes the wealthy wore were often produced in sweatshops, where women worked by the light of a single tallow candle until their eyes bled from the strain. The dainty maiden in her silk dress was, quite literally, wearing the stolen eyesight and the fractured spines of her sisters in the slums. This wasn't a society of knights, it was a society of predators and prey. The chivalry we read about was a thin veneer of manners designed to hide the fact that the entire economy was fueled by the systematic exhaustion of human life. You think your workplace is stressful? The Victorian worker lived under the constant shadow of the workhouse. If you were injured, if you grew too old, or if the economy shifted, you weren't given a severance package. You were sent to a fortress of shame, where families were deliberately separated, husbands from wives, parents from children, to ensure that poverty was punished as a moral failing. The fear of the workhouse was the whip that kept the Victorian heart beating. It was a world where you worked until you dropped, and then you were discarded like the coal ash from a furnace. As we watch the shadows dance on the ceiling, you must realize that the glamour of the Victorian age was a luxury bought with the blood of 1,000 unimportant lives. But the grind of the factory was only the visible enemy. If you survived the machines and the exhaustion, you still had to face the most terrifying authority of all, the Victorian state and its miracles of medicine. We are moving now into the heart of the nightmare, where the police truncheon and the surgeon's saw were the only thing standing between you and the grave. Please subscribe to our chronicle and join our circle, for the light of the fire is the only protection we have against the chilling truths of the Victorian courtroom and the theater of blood that lies ahead. The fire is dying into a deep crimson glow, and the silence of the room feels heavy, as if the very walls are listening to the secrets of a century past. We have seen the machines that broke the body, but now we must face the terrors that broke the spirit. In our world, we trust in the shield of the law and the miracles of modern medicine. But in the mid-1800s, the shield was a heavy truncheon, and the miracle was often a death sentence disguised as a cure. I want you to imagine walking through the soot-choked labyrinth of 7 dials at midnight. The gaslight flickers, casting long, skeletal shadows that seem to move with a life of their own. You hear a rhythmic, heavy tread on the cobblestones, the peelers, the first modern police. To a Victorian, the sight of a blue coat wasn't always a sign of safety. It was the face of a state that viewed poverty as a crime. If you were found sleeping in a doorway during your watch hour, you weren't given a bed, you were given a cell. The justice of the era was swift and theatrical. Minor thefts could lead to a one-way voyage to the penal colonies of Australia, a journey across the world from which few ever returned. The fear of the law was a constant, cold companion, a shadow that sat every dinner table in the slums. But the law was a visible enemy. Far more terrifying were the invisible killers that haunted the very air and water of London. While you might worry about a seasonal flu, the Victorian lived in the shadow of the Blue Death, cholera. They didn't understand that the water they drank, drawn from the same Thames that acted as the city's open sewer, was a liquid poison. Here's a terrifying fact. The very people sworn to heal you were often the ones who ensured your demise. We live in an age of sterilized precision, but the Victorian surgeon was a man of lightning speed and unwashed hands. Before the reliable use of anesthesia, the only mercy a surgeon could offer was velocity. Imagine being strapped to a wooden table in a tiered operating theater, a crowd of medical students watching as the surgeon, often wearing a frock coat encrusted with the dried blood of a dozen previous patients, reaches for his saw. He had to be fast. If the amputation took more than 30 seconds, the shock of the pain would stop your heart. This was the medieval WebMD of the 1850s. A world where the cure was a frantic, visceral race against agony, performed in a room that smelled of sawdust and rot. They believed in miasma, the idea that foul smells carried disease. To fight the smell, they would seal their rooms, effectively trapping the airborne bacteria of tuberculosis, the White Plague, inside with them. Every cough in a shared bed was a potential death knell for the entire family. It was a world where you could be healthy at breakfast and a memory by tea time, your body turning a ghastly bruised blue as it withered from dehydration. You were trapped between a state that wanted to punish your misery and a biology that wanted to consume your lungs. But as the gaslight fades and we reach the final, most harrowing chapter of our journey, we must confront the ultimate truth of the Victorian night. If the machines didn't kill you, and the law didn't break you, and the cholera didn't claim you, there was still the reality of the great misery. I invite you to leave a mark of your own presence before we move forward. If you have felt the weight of these shadows, share this chronicle with another soul who seeks refuge in the past. Your interaction is the pulse that keeps these histories alive. Stay with me for the final embers, for as we move toward the climax of this Victorian struggle, you will discover that even the one place you thought was safe, your own mind, was the final battlefield. The fire has finally surrendered to the gray, cold ash of the morning, and the silence of the room is now so profound it feels like a physical weight. We have walked through the gauntlet of the Victorian world, surviving the poisoned pantry, the scatological nightmares of the streets, and the grinding iron gears of the factories. But as the shadows lengthen, we must face the most harrowing truth of all. In our modern world, we view the night as a sanctuary, a time where the world stops and we are finally safe behind our locked doors. But for the Victorian, the night was not a refuge. It was the climax of their misery. Imagine the general misery of a London winter night in 1860. You are exhausted from a 16-hour shift, your lungs heavy with coal dust, and you return to a room you share with 3 other families. There is no heat, only the damp chill that seeps through the brickwork like a ghost. In this era, even the act of resting was a war. We speak of sleep hygiene today, but their hygiene was a matter of basic survival. Families would huddle together for warmth, not out of affection, but because body heat was the only fuel they could afford. And then there was the constant looming threat of the Great Unrest. The Victorian era was not just an age of peace. It was a century of constant, bloody colonial wars and the ever-present fear of revolution at home. If you were a young man, the career counselor of the street might recruit you into the army, sending you to die of dysentery in the Crimea or the heat of India, fighting for an empire that didn't know your name. Those who stayed behind lived in fear of the bread riots and the heavy-handed response of a government that saw a starving crowd as a mob to be crushed. You were never truly safe. Not in your bed, not in your workplace, and certainly not in your own mind. Here's a terrifying fact. The Victorian obsession with death culture wasn't just a morbid quirk. It was a coping mechanism for a world where death was the most frequent visitor. They took photographs of their dead children as if they were sleeping, dressed them in their finest clothes, and posed them with their toys. This was their medieval WebMD of the soul, a desperate attempt to hold on to something in a world that took everything away. They lived in a state of perpetual mourning, a society where the black crepe of a funeral veil was the most common fashion accessory. But now, as the dawn finally breaks over the soot-stained horizon of London, I want you to take a deep breath. Feel the air in your lungs, clean, filtered, and safe. Look at the water in your glass, clear and free of the blue death. We have walked through the valley of the shadow of the 19th century, and it is time to return. The alivio di ritorno, the relief of the return, is the greatest gift this journey can give you. You survived. You survived the alum in the bread, the brains in the milk, the cholera in the pump, and the surgeon's unwashed saw. You survived the workhouse and the great stink. As you sit in the luxury of your modern life, let a feeling of profound gratitude wash over you. The hardships of your day, the slow internet, the long meeting, the traffic, are ghosts compared to the visceral, blood-soaked reality of the ancestors who built the world you now inhabit. They endured the nightmare so that you could live the dream. As we extinguish the last candle and step back into the light of the present, I want to thank you for walking this path with me. Your curiosity is the bridge that connects us to those lost souls. If this journey has changed the way you look at your own life, I invite you to share this experience. Send this to someone who needs a reminder of how fortunate they truly are. And before you go, tell me in the comments, which part of the Victorian struggle shocked you the most? Your words are the final tribute to those who lived through the gaslit dark. Until the next fog rolls in, stay safe, stay grateful, and remember, the fire is always burning here for you.